Oh, welcome to our last speaker of the day, one of our keynotes, Şerife Tekin. Şerife received her bachelor's degree from Metaphysics in the economics department, and after that she went to Canada to receive her PhD degree from York University, and after that she received the postdoc. Sorry, she did a postdoc at Pittsburgh, and now she is an assistant professor at San Antonio, Texas University. We are very happy to have her here, so a big applause.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Saniye and Sandrine for bringing us all together. I'm very, very excited that there's now a Society for Women in Philosophy in Turkey. That's just truly moving, and I feel really invigorated and moved by this conference and meeting all of you. Annem ve kardeşlerim burada. O yüzden böyle biraz baskının yükseldiğini hissettim. Bana çiçek falan getirmişler. Annem en büyük ilk kadın filozofum. Bir de şey anlatacağım. Dün Saniye sağ olsun bir araba geldi. Ben birkaç gün önce geldim. Ablamda kalıyorum Ankara'da. Dün arabayla beni taksi şoförü getiriyor. Çok tatlı bir insan. Hemen böyle sohbete başladık. Ne olacak bu memleketin hali falan şeklinde. Sonra hocam bize listeler geldi. Hep bayan hocalar var. Hepiniz bayansınız ya. Ben dedim ki evet, kadın felsefecileri topluluğu. Hep kadın hocalar geldi. Ben kadın dedikçe adamcağız böyle azardı. Böyle kadın dememi istemiyor dedim, susayım artık. Öyle bir başlangıç. O yüzden hani biraz korkuttuk galiba. İyi bir başlangıç diye düşünüyorum. So today's talk is part of a larger project on what I think of as psychiatric epistemology, about how to increase knowledge in psychiatry on mental disorders. So if you were to kind of describe broadly what I mean by psychiatric epistemology is how can we expand knowledge on mental disorders? What do we do to acquire more information about mental disorders so that we can identify their properties? I have to also mention that when I say mental disorders, I'm not going to be talking about like, is there really such thing, mental disorder? I'm just going to take that for granted that there is such thing as mental disorder, and there are people suffering from it, and not kind of engage with that debate in this particular talk. And properties of mental disorders are important, so we want to understand them primarily because if we know the properties of an object, and we can kind of think of a mental disorder as a universe on its own, we can identify its properties scientifically so that we can explain what they are, but most importantly, we can predict their course. We can predict how a person with bipolar disorder might behave in the next stage, and what kind of things we might expect from their behavior in the future, so that actually we can develop effective interventions on to help people with mental disorders to lead good, happy lives. So when I kind of think about mental disorder as a universe and kind of think about understanding what mental disorder or increasing knowledge about mental disorder, we can kind of think of different sources of information. So the first thing that comes to mind is scientific research on mental disorders. So we can talk to psychiatrists and clinicians who work with patients. We can look at drug trials and various scientific research involving the clinic. We can also look at more kind of data emerging from more one-on-one settings. We can talk to psychologists who give cognitive behavior therapy on individuals and acquire information about how people's anxiety patterns change, say, in response to cognitive behavior therapy. There is also unfortunately not very well recognized or appreciated source of knowledge that comes from first-person experiences of those people with mental disorders. And I see this as kind of a feminist project because in this case, the unheard or the silenced voice is the voice of the individual suffering from mental disorder. So in dominant frameworks in psychiatry who aims to expand knowledge on mental disorders in scientific paradigms, they focus a lot on clinical drug trials and also data emerging from in these clinical settings, but they have not been similarly invested in understanding and engaging with the first-person experience of mental illness. So in other words, people who suffer from mental disorder have not been made part of the scientific inquiry on understanding what mental disorders are. And I have a problem with this, and I want to rectify this kind of unbalanced way of understanding or expanding epistemology of mental disorders, and argue that we can actually, in fact, view patients with mental disorders as experts, which I will call experience-based experts, and use the information that comes from them in expanding psychiatric epistemology. So to do this, the plan for today is I will first look at assumptions of expertise in psychiatry. When psychiatrists or philosophers of psychiatry talk about experts, being an expert on mental disorders, what do they mean by that? Who is the expert? And then I will actually challenge this notion of expertise. When we look at these traditional frameworks, what we find is when they construe expertise, they're actually primarily talking about the individuals who are trained in psychopathology, who have some kind of formal degree. I will challenge that notion, and I will suggest that patients too can be recognized as experts. Their expertise is not granted degrees, or they're not recognized officially, but they are what I will call experience-based experts, and I will consider some objections. So my primary focus will be Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So as many of you know, this is the paradigmatic, the book that lists the criteria for mental disorders. It's published in the United States, but it's widely used around the world, including places like Turkey. And it offers a framework for understanding mental disorders. I take DSM as a paradigm case. There are other scientific frameworks that we can look at as well, but DSM-led psychiatric research is the most highest funded research in the entire world. And one of the goals of creating the DSM project is actually to expand knowledge on mental disorders. DSM is also used for clinical purposes, for forensic purposes, for insurance purposes, for a variety of purposes. So it's a very influential document. In fact, that's probably why it's often referred to as the Bible of psychiatry, as being the main book that tells you, what happens next and whatnot. So, and the evolution of the DSM actually kind of shows how psychiatrists what psychiatrists took to be expertise, and I will go over that. DSM has 5 editions. The idea is this: why do we keep changing the DSM? Well, mental illness research is a dynamic field. Science on mental disorders is renewing itself, and we have a better understanding of it. So the diagnostic criteria that we use should reflect the most recent science. That's why we regularly revisit the diagnostic criteria and revise and edit. So let's look at how the DSM, or how in the context of DSM, the concept of expertise is used. What is meant by expertise? So interestingly, if you go all the way back to the late 19th century, kind of before the DSM was created, the initial purpose of creating a diagnostic criteria or compiling all the mental disorders together was for census reasons. People wanted to understand how many people in the population were so-called insane, and this was primarily because the US government wanted to get an understanding of how many people were fit to serve in the military. So if you were mentally insane, and I use insane in quotation marks, you weren't going to be able to serve in the military, but if you were fine, you would be able to go. So the primary motivation was very pragmatic. In a way, there was a social need for classifying mental disorders. So to reflect this, a number of things happened. So the first document that classifies mental disorders is published in 1840 for these classificatory reasons, and then in 1844, American Superintendents of Institutions for the Insane was formed, and this institution later became the American Psychiatric Association, which is now the primary body that actually revises and publishes the DSM regularly. So that's kind of the history. So, and at this time still there was no one single document that collects all the mental disorders, and World War II started, and at that time US psychiatrists were heavily involved in diagnosing and classifying people, again, to determine who goes to war, who stays back home. So, and following the World War II, a committee led by psychiatrists, this is very important, who are trained in understanding psychopathology, formed this document called Medical 203, and around the same time in Europe, the International Classification of Disease that is published by the World Health Organization, for the first time in 1949, they actually listed mental disorders as a component of the general diagnostic schema for all kinds of illnesses. So following this, US said, well, now that WHO also, the International Classification of Diseases, also published a document on mental disorders, we should also publish one. So that's how the DSM-1 was created. Again, our focus today is what is expertise in psychiatry. And when you look at the introduction of the DSM, I'm being such a nerd, I have all the electronic copies of all the DSMs, and I entered the word expertise in the PDF search function. I love technology. And I looked at the repetitions of expertise in different parts of the documents, and you usually see phrases like this. Usually there's a listing of who are the most knowledgeable people or groups in the society on mental disorders. So there is, the DSM is a scientific product, but it's also a social product because it's used in so many different aspects in mental health care, that there's this constant emphasis on how they consulted all the experts to come up with the best classificatory schema, and it usually reads like this. I'm not going to read the whole quotation, and this is from the introduction of the DSM-1. Look at all these societies: American Neurological Association, American Psychoanalytic Association, Academy of Neurology, American Psychopathological Association, etc. So these are all associations that are formed mostly by men. That's another topic that I'm not going to be focusing today, but they're mostly men, and they're all trained in psychopathology, and they are the ones who were consulted in creating this scientific framework. So that's DSM-1. And following certain changes in the International Classification of Diseases, the DSM also was revised, and the DSM-2 was published. And in both DSM-1 and the 2, the emphasis has been bringing together psychiatrists with different specialties to provide a full coverage of all areas in psychiatry. So, I mean, it's actually interesting to read these documents very closely, because there's this constant focus on, we consulted that person too, we consulted them, etc. And, interestingly, in the DSM-1 and 2, it also says we also consulted the military. So on the one hand, there is this kind of idea that this is something that we do by consulting to people who are trained in this field, but also we consult to the military, and that's kind of a interesting note to keep in mind for my purposes for later. So, and when you look at again, like, experts are those professionals who are trained in psychopathology. So that's the assumption. So in the DSM-3, it pretty much stays the same. So DSM-3 really tried to rebrand itself, because the first two editions of the DSM were highly influenced by the psychoanalytic frameworks. And at that time, it wasn't cool to love Freud anymore. Freud wasn't considered scientific. Popper had written criticism of how Freud, or psychoanalysis in general, is not science. So there was this kind of desire in US psychiatric world to distance themselves from psychoanalysis, which meant that the DSM was going to be revised to remove all the psychoanalytic influences and to make the DSM-3 more prone to scientific investigation. So what does that look like? Well, let's classify mental disorders according to those properties that we can show. We can measure and we can validate. So that makes it kind of scientifically valid rather than thinking about childhood oppression or sexual relations with parents and how they lead to psychopathology, which was the psychoanalysis main focus. Around that time, so now the DSM is trying to want to be properly scientific and objective, again, there is even more increased focus on consulting the experts. So they basically broaden the group of people or the organizations that they consult with. For instance, for the first time, they consulted American Women's Psychiatric Association for their particular input in revising the DSM, which I consider to be a positive step. However, so again, this is the list basically of all the organizations that were consulted: American Psychological Association, American College Health Association, and various kinds of specialties. But again, in this list, experts were considered as those who are primarily trained in psychiatry, one way or another. Wherever possible, so this is again from the DSM-3 introduction, it says, whenever possible, attempts have been made to seek advice of experts in each specific area under consideration. Again, all of those experts consulted were those who were trained in psychopathology. So when we come to DSM-4, it's still the same. Again, there's still kind of psychiatry's legitimacy crisis. We are scientific, and here are all the experts that we are consulting. Again, they're like forensic specialists, international experts. Everyone is being consulted, but again, patients who are experiencing mental disorder and who can actually provide us a lot of information about what it is like to be a person with mental illness, they are not part of the system. So things started to change just before the DSM-5 publication process. So this is personally very exciting for me. So I was writing my dissertation in kind of philosophy of mind and the self, and my kind of empirical case was mental disorder. So I was working very closely with the DSM. This was 2009, 2008, and DSM-5 was going to be published in 2010. So I was dreaming of that day that I would, order my copy and like look at what's going to happen, because there was a lot of conversations about wanting to revamp the DSM-5 to make it even more scientific. But then it got delayed. I got really upset. Like I defended my dissertation, but DSM-5 was nowhere to be found. But it was published in 3 years later. During that 3 years, there were actually a lot of movements coming from patients themselves and their families to occupy the APA. And those years were was when the Occupy movement was very big in the United States. So this is actually, these pictures are from a protest in San Francisco in, I think, 2012 or 2013. American Psychiatric Association meeting was in San Francisco at that time, and there were a group of activists who were patients or survivors, as they call themselves sometimes, were there protesting the APA because of all the history of patient suffering because of various psychiatric, various policies relating to psychiatry, but they also felt strongly that their voices were not being heard in the creation of the DSM-5 process. So people say things like, well, I'm the one who will be diagnosed with autism or with bipolar disorder, and it will affect directly my life and how I will get permission from my work, but yet I'm not part of the conversation and nobody's asking me for my input. So to kind of address this, and again, remember the APA has constantly made efforts to kind of show itself as consulting to experts in the field. They said, this time we will get feedback from the general public. And they also invited, kind of, they wanted to make the DSM process as, collaborative as possible. And they wanted to invite or include all the what they called stakeholders in the process. But these are primarily concerns coming for social reasons. So the APA welcomed having patient input only because insofar as they were members of public. So because it will be something that that will influence them, yeah, maybe we should be making them part of the conversation. There wasn't a direct commitment coming from the APA, but a lot of psychiatrists who are very critical of the APA policies, and some of them are actually philosophers at the same time too, have written articles, and they talked about how science should be a democratic process, being heavily influenced by feminist epistemology, that we should include different kinds of people in the table and make them part of the analysis and so on. And because democracy requires people to express their opinions and inputs on something, and patients with mental disorders, people with mental disorders are members of the public, so democracy requires that we include them in the scientific process. And some people have written it from the perspective of patient advocacy, and they said for scientific experts to review their nosological recommendations in the light of rigorous consideration of consumer experience and feedback. So they wanted people who were diagnosed to give feedback. So this is all very positive and interesting, but I worry that there hasn't been much emphasis on more epistemological concerns. Of course, it's very important for science to be democratic or be as inclusive as possible of the general members of general public, but I think a random member of the general public and the patient have this different epistemic status when it comes to mental disorder. So I think the motivation to include patients should also be more of a project about epistemology. We have something very complex as mental disorder. It's a constantly moving target. Every individual experiences the same illness, which is to be argued, maybe they're not the same illness, but in different ways, people's particular life circumstances and experiences affect that illness experience in different ways. Is extremely complex. A drug that works so well with someone doesn't work with the other person at all. So we need all the information that we can gather about mental disorders. So in this sense, patients are resources, not just for public or democracy reasons, but precisely for epistemological reasons. We want to bring them to the table because we need their input. So. And the DSM-5 task force, actually, it was very interesting. They said, okay, that's great. Yeah, we should involve the public. Again, there wasn't any specific addressing of patients, involving patients directly, but they said, we want to involve the public. And we will use all the benefits of internet. So they created a website with the preliminary diagnostic criteria, and they invited people to give inputs. So this was very interesting. So they, are seemingly making the process more democratic or collaborative or inclusive, but you typed in your input, which I did, of course, I'm waiting for it to be released, and I'm in front of my computer giving all the feedback that I can, and boom, I said submit comment. I didn't get a recognition, how you submit a journal, an article, and it comes confirming that you submitted. Nothing, and I have not heard at all about whether or not, and if, how they actually incorporated feedback. And people, later on, after the DSM-5 was published, they advertised this as having involved the public very collaboratively. I don't know anyone who actually was able to get some kind of clarification as to how they incorporated it. So, I don't know what happened, but I don't really trust that process. So, what am I saying? This is the same, and then after this, they basically published another paper that just kind of, again, highlighted experts with backgrounds in psychology, social work, and so on. Again, expertise is all the ones who have degrees, PhDs, MDs, and so on. So, this kind of reminds us a debate that took place in the history of philosophy of science about what actually expertise means. So, this is, so many books have been written about this, but I'm just going to summarize it in 5 words and it will be incomplete. But here's how the story goes. So during the times of logical positivism, in 1930s, 40s, there was a high kind of emphasis and admiration of sciences. It was really, really good to be doing science, and science was objective, and it revealed us independent results, and we could, have a view from nowhere and have attained objective knowledge about the universe by using scientific methodology. But these assumptions about objectivity of science, or the kind of trustworthiness of science, started shaking a little bit when Kuhn wrote his Structure of Scientific Revolutions. What Kuhn showed us was there were two emphases. So one is, actually, science is not done in this ideal universe, independent from people who are doing it, but scientists are people. So all the biases, values, subjective experiences that we suffer as individuals, scientists are also subject to that. So they're not exempt from the values and biases that shape our own lives. Which means then scientific theory change is not always because a better theory comes along that is more objective, more responsive to reality and so on, but sometimes a theory pervades over the other theory primarily because there are better supporters of it. So it's more of a psychological process rather than a purely scientific process. So this basically created this huge anti-science movement in that, well, we can't trust science. It's not objective. It's biased. It can be, Nazis can do science. It can be racist. It can be sexist. So a lot of conversations were happening at that time, and there was an emphasis to maybe involve more people as well as people who are being influenced by the scientific activity into the scientific process. So again, at those times, there were sociological concerns about, again, making the science democratic and so on, but also more epistemological concerns. And some scholars in science studies, which they classify themselves as having three waves, just like the feminist movement, and they basically say, okay, so we don't want to involve random people to the scientific research process necessarily only because they're members of the public, because knowledge, still expertise or understanding, a good, robust understanding of the subject matter still is important. So there are these social concerns about making the scientific progress as democratic as possible, but there are also epistemological concerns. They say, let's make a distinction between different kinds of expertise. So one is what they call technically qualified by experience, which is what then later they refer to as experience-based experts. These individuals do not have degrees, they don't have recognized training, and that is internationally valid, but they basically know about the subject matter because they've experienced it. And they use it in different examples involving sheep farmers and Chernobyl and different kinds of examples. And I want to use this kind of framework to talk about expertise in psychiatry, so that we can kind of have two classes of experts in psychiatry or in science in general. Ones have the expertise by virtue of their training. Yes, a psychiatrist or a social worker or a psychologist knows a lot about mental disorders because they've treated patients. But so does experience-based patients. A patient might provide a lot of insight into the experience of mental disorder that will, remember the first slide, that will take us to the properties of mental disorder so that we can help people with similar illnesses in similar ways or help that particular person. So when I say experience-based experts, again, my work is primarily, I think this is also a feminist commitment, my work is primarily informed by obviously scientific and clinical research in psychiatry, but also the first-person stories of patients. Professor Drek had emphasized the importance of phenomenology, and in my conversations with Professor Erkazan, we've been talking about the very importance of those first-person stories, and I'm really, really excited about bringing those first-person experiences as experts to the kind of discussions in psychiatric epistemology. So my methodology, because I'm a philosopher, I can't really do qualitative scientific research, at least not yet. I have a kind of pipe dream of maybe getting a PhD in psychology when I grow up. Maybe that will happen one day. Maybe I won't need the psychology PhD. I can just learn qualitative analysis methods. But my methodology so far has been primarily reading the memoirs of people who were able to write about their experiences. I grant that not every patient is actually capable of doing that. They don't have resources, they don't have the intellectual resources perhaps, but there is still a large body of work out there that details the first-person experiences of those encountering mental illness. So this is Ellen Sachs. She's actually a law professor at UCLA. She was a philosophy student at Oxford back at some point. William Styron famously wrote about his depression. Kay Jamieson wrote about her bipolar disorder, and Pat Capone, she's also an activist in Toronto, wrote about the relationship between poverty and mental illness. So you might ask, okay, so they are experts on what? Like, what do you learn from these memoirs? So I have been kind of detailing in different ways, in different bodies of work, about exactly what we learn from them. So first is what I call orientational challenges, so involved in mental disorder. And by orientational challenges, I mean maybe like symptoms of mental disorder. I don't like the medical language, but so orientational challenges would be someone having anxiety, just primarily because of depression, like the immediate impact of mental illness due to, and those symptoms disorienting the individual, and that's why I call them orientational challenges. So we can learn about how these particular anxieties or hallucinations and so on might be affecting people and influencing them. Another thing that we learn from these memoirs, and again, these are written by people who actually learn to live and flourish withstanding their mental illness, and some of their stories are very inspiring, and you learn about their courage and what kind of relationships helped them in that process. So you learn about perhaps how you might help someone that you know with mental illness, kind of using the resources that they provide there because they had that first-person experiences. You might learn about their responses to different treatment methods. Somebody might say, well, I really benefited from psychoanalysis. That's, for instance, what Ellen Sachs says, but then Kay Jamieson talks about how horrible it was for her to be psychoanalyzed, and it's a horrible form of treatment. So you get kind of information about different responses to different kinds of treatments. And their feelings about their relationships, how they respond to stigma, what kind of institutional barriers they face in their lives, and so on. So, in short, they do offer us a wide variety of information that will help us further of our understanding of mental disorders. So what an objection might be, and there might be several objections to this argument, is this kind of, well, people who you want to consult are crazy. They're mentally ill, and they're not competent enough to make meaningful contributions to scientific research in mental disorders. So my response, first, this is false. I mean, these examples, I think, alone illustrate that that's not true, because one of the interesting and puzzling and confusing and maybe really bad things about mental disorders is that it's very volatile, right? A person who is depressed may overeat one day and undereat the next day. There's not a lot of stability in the way that they encounter their symptoms. Sometimes they may really have trouble focusing, concentrating, and so on, but a few days later it might be different. So it's not correct to generalize something like competence or rationality or decision-making capacity as a blanket statement as if it's affecting all people with mental disorders at all times. So that's an overgeneralization. We have examples of people who actually do write about those stabilities and instabilities and how they suffered poor judgment and spent a lot of money, and then they kind of come back and rethink about it and so on. So in a lot of cases, patient has kind of insight into their mental disorder, meaning they are more or less aware how that particular condition is actually affecting their lives. Of course, there are exceptions, but there are exceptions in all kinds of expertise. Not all experts who are technically qualified have degrees. They don't make them the best experts. So even if we consider, let's say that we included a patient in the table on the conversation about mental disorders or creating the DSM, they will say, you know, go manic in the middle of the meeting and disrupt the meeting. But these kinds of risks are there for others as well. And just like there's the criteria of selection for inclusion of scientists in the scientific decision-making process, there could also be a selection criteria for people with mental disorders to kind of determine the level of their expertise and, you know, what we might expect them to bring to the table. So in what I call this, this is the last slide, I want to summarize like what I've been talking about. So in a way, what I'm proposing here is to expand psychiatric epistemology, we should be using what I call a trilateral strategy. So the sources of information will be coming from first-person accounts of those with mental disorders, and I'm actually I only wrote first-person accounts because I don't want to limit this only to patients who are experiencing mental disorder. Sometimes their family members or loved ones are also much better experts than the patients themselves. So first-person account, therefore, include not only the patients, but family members or people who have been with individuals with mental disorders along that path. Obviously, scientific research on mental disorders and clinical work on mental disorders. So these are three legs of the pillars. And I want to go back to what Professor Erkazan said this morning about how philosophy is very important in making connections. And I think that's the role I see myself as a philosopher playing in this kind of expansion of psychiatric epistemology project, because part of that project involves scientific research, but philosophers are there to, I think, engage with the first-person experiences and the scientific work and keep talking about these issues, and because none of these resources are going to be exhaustive. Like, we won't be able to solve or know everything to know about mental disorders by just relying on first-person accounts or by just relying on clinical encounters. We need all of them together. Going back to Hippocrates, where it all started. One of my favorite quotes from Hippocrates is this: it's more important to know what sort of a person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has. Right? So if you want to understand a person, we need trilateral strategy. So thank you. Yeah, why don't you take it? I'm just excited and I'll be like all over the place.
Yeah,
thank you very much. This was very, very illuminating. I speak in English, right?
Yeah, I mean,
please excuse my question. Maybe it is from sheer ignorance. But when you mentioned, for instance, that a person's first-person experience of eating less one day, eating more the other day, or bipolar disorder, as I know, have ups and downs, and so on and so forth. So this is, of course, very important as that they be like experts, as you call them. But don't the psychiatrists or the scientific experts also rely on those kind of first-personal experiences to come up with definitions, to come up with cures? Because when you look over the internet, you see that bipolar disorder may give ups and downs one day, but they do not just invent them, do they?
No,
so
this is a wonderful question.
There is already first-person experience as they are conversing with to see what the. So what is the added-on benefit? Although I see, of course, if you read their memoirs, this will help, definitely. But, so, them being experts and the psychiatrists or scientists being experts, as you also said, may not be on the same level, but we can call both of them experts. So my primary question is, what is the added-on benefit?
This is a great question, and I'm glad you asked this. So it is true, the way you look at, especially DSM-3+, there's a lot of focus on the symptoms, and I mean, I always say this, I'm actually a big fan of the kind of success of the DSM in capturing a lot of stuff. Like, you read the scripture, you're like, this is actually really true, right? So it's based on those symptoms, but I have two worries there. So one is, when you actually read about how they came up with the criteria, it looks very dubious. So there hasn't been extensive, for instance, clinical trials that gave them the information. A group of experts sit down in front of the table, and I'm not joking, this is what happened with the DSM-3 when Robert Spitzer was chairing. They listed what they observed the most in their patients. So it's not, I mean, this is not wrong, it's important, it's a clinical perspective, but this has the risk of who did the listing and how did they talk about it. And a lot of, for instance, diagnostic criteria like the premenstrual dysmorphic disorder now is a medical condition in the DSM, and a lot of feminists are really worried about that classification, I think rightly so, and it was basically, a group of men came together and talked about that as an illness. So I think it has that risk of, because it's not based on these wide clinical, maybe longitudinal studies and so on, so that's one concern. And the other concern is, even if we did that, like even if we made sure that there were extensive interviews or conversations and clinical studies, after all, DSM is trying to do too many things at the same time. So one of their goals is to be useful in the kind of social or clinical and insurance purposes. So their descriptions have to be very brief. So I call this in the past hyponarrative. So the narrative is very limited. It's symptom-based. You have this, and the story around that, the narrative around that very symptom might be very different. So for instance, there's very little room on poverty or various social circumstances and so on. And there are very intrinsic and important aspects of mental disorder, because sometimes some of those social conditions lead to mental disorder, something like post-traumatic stress disorder following sexual violence, right? And that context is very important, and by definition, that document has to be limited. And that's why I don't want to rule out what the DSM is doing completely, because I think they are definitely part of that picture. But in the narratives or first-person accounts, we get the more thick story of what's the context, how race influences. A lot of women, African-American women, I learn something new about race in America every day, and I keep being surprised. I don't know why I keep being surprised, but a lot of African-American women were subject to wild psychiatric experiments back in the day. And again, we can say, well, they did scientific research, but then this particular group was disproportionately influenced and harmed by it. So I think that's what I would say the
Thank you very much. Yes.
Camera?
Thanks, Şerife. That's great. I think my question is kind of related to Hülya''s question. But, I mean, at the first point, the person has to realize that there is something wrong with the person, right? And then the person probably goes to the internet and checks out, oh, I have these symptoms, and he or she is reading the internet, reading something on the internet and thinking that probably I should go to an expert, or probably I should go to someone who knows better than I do. And then that person goes to that, the doctor or social worker, whatever, or psychologist, right? And then that person wants to be diagnosed, right? Or expects to be diagnosed because he trusts or she trusts on the expert, right? And then the expert makes the diagnostics, right? And the person is happy because he knows that, well, at least he has an illness, which is a name, maybe it can be treated, right? But, I mean, at what point here the person is making a contribution? Maybe the person can disagree with the treatment, right? Maybe the treatment, she might say that, well, this pills or this treatment is not working on me. But, of course, we can trust on that. But at what point the person is making a contribution to the diagnosis?
That's a good question. Actually, my dissertation ended up being precisely that. I was really attracted to this notion that Ian Hacking used at one time, what he calls looping effects. And when he says looping effects, he's talking about how the very classification that scientists come up with influence the patient diagnosed and changes them in response to that particular label. So because there is now this category of bipolar, I type up my symptoms, and there is that bipolar, and then I somehow start acting like I am one, and then, like talking earlier about like imitation, right? And then like it becomes this kind of looping, and then, Hagen talks about how people with mental disorder become moving targets and so on. And here's what I came up with. So one idea would be, well, if the person is looped, you wouldn't be learning anything new. But I think there are two things. So one is, I think it's very important to expand our conceptual horizon in thinking about, what is called, like the so-called mental illness, right? Right now, any kind of anomaly or disruption or irregularity that people or kids experience are intrinsically, labeled with a psychiatric classification, because I think we don't have conceptual spaces to talk about these experiences in different ways. I mean, in some religious circles, like some people think of them as like religious trends and so on, but we don't have those alternative frameworks, and I think we are running the risk as a society of like just being kind of thinking about everything in terms of illness. So, but if we give room to, I guess maybe more complex, more like hyper-narrative first-person accounts, we might find different conceptual spaces. So actually, some of the memoirs that I read in my dissertation, I really felt like I was rereading the DSM-5 or DSM-4, right? Because the patient really took on board that story that comes from the DSM and like, fueled by the media and social media and so on, and thinks of, like, write about themselves in that way, but then you have more thicker, like, developed narratives about, like, addiction and, like, first-person encounter, they're more thick. And I think kind of making these first-person accounts part of this framework might actually help us kind of get these, more different, various kinds of stories. But the risk that you're, pointing out is definitely real. What?
Does the nature of mental disorder affect your account in any way?
Yes.
For example, like selecting the patients.
Yes.
Or even relying on their expertise.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's like, to deny that would be kind of, would be an overstatement. Like, we can't assume that depression doesn't disrupt your decision-making capacity or desperation that you feel. But actually, a recent paper just is coming out that I'm like writing a response, and they show that patients really do, so patients who want to do deep brain stimulation, like this is the new neurointervention. Have you seen one? So basically, they put electrodes in your, like, somewhere in your head, and like they insert it, and it's like you wear this little machine, and you simulate, you touch the button once in a while, and then it kind of rewires your brain. And some people with treatment-resistant depression actually benefit from it. But the jury is like still out. Like, we don't know much about this neurotechnology, and not every patient, of course, want to be kind of experimented on. So it's like largely kind of all the research clinical trials are running are like on a voluntary basis. But they just did this study on, and like there are some legitimate worries about patients are feeling desperate and they don't have the most able decision-making capacity because they're depressed. So is it really, can we really get their consent to kind of this treatment? How can we know that they really know what they're getting into? So they did this study involving patients, and they who were asked if they want deep brain stimulation, and they all said no. And then these interviews are about why they think that they don't want to have it. And a lot of the patients actually talk about, well, I know that my depression makes me vulnerable. I don't make the best decisions. I can't even decide what I'm going to wear to work, and I ask my wife for help, and I can't trust my judgment about deep brain stimulation, so I'm not going to volunteer to receive this treatment. So that's very interesting, right? On the one hand, yes, their decision-making capacity is compromised, so they're not the perfect candidates for my maybe expertise, yet they seem to be an expert in somehow noticing that they're not the best decision makers. And actually the solutions that they come up with are very feminist. They talk about, well, I will enroll my doctor's sister to the process, and I will enroll some other people, I will do more research. So they want to kind of make that process more collaborative, therefore they will come up with the best decision for themselves. So it definitely has an impact on my view, but again, because I'm not saying you should only use first-person accounts, it's not. It's great.
So far, and then, yeah, but, sorry.
So I will call the patients the experiential experts, and the psychiatrists and scientists working on this issue academic experts. Now, when I was listening to your talk, actually I was thinking about the first question that you answered, right? So I was asking, okay, these, I think what you propose is, if I remember, if I understand correctly, that this academic expertise, right, this academic expertise should be supplemented by experiential expertise, right? So when I heard that, I was thinking, okay, but this shows that there's something very wrong with the academic expertise because it's in need of being supplemented by some other expertise. It shouldn't have, normally. So the first person that counts should be actually integrated in academic expertise rather than.
That's a great suggestion, actually. I haven't thought about that. Yeah, I will definitely think that that's absolutely true. I mean, in a way, it's showing like the limitations of academic expertise. But somebody might say this: listen, I'm a psychiatrist. I see a lot of patients and so on. But like, even if I actually consult with my patients on this matter, I will never know what it is like to have mental illness. So they might question whether academic expertise, just on the basis of the academicness of that expertise, will ever become a first-person expertise. But like Kay Jameson is a very good example. So she has bipolar disorder, and she's also a psychiatrist. So she writes using, her perspective as a patient, but also her perspective as a doctor, which is sometimes not as great. She tends to over-medicalize everything. She even medicalized creativity in her recent book, which I worry about romanticizing mental illness as like, oh, it makes you creative, and if you have mental illness and not creative, you're like, oops, I'm not even creative, I'm mad. So it creates this kind of, I think it romanticizes the suffering, but yeah, but that's a great suggestion. Thank you, Tufan. I will acknowledge you in footnotes.
Full done, and then edit, and then.
Thank you for your talk. I think it was really illuminating. And actually, my friend Şerife and I, we were talking last night about chronic illness. So this question is going to be of a different context, I guess. But a lot of the times, chronic illness does have a mental disorder dimension to the anxiety or depression, not always. But one thing that we talked about is that for those of us who suffer from chronic illness, when we go see a medical professional, oftentimes we don't feel heard. Oftentimes they would just say, oh, do you have a headache? Okay, take this pill. Or do you feel nauseated? Oh, take this pill. Or can't you sleep? Oh, okay, there's a pill for that, right? So this is a common experience that we have. And living with chronic illness pretty much means being an expert over time about your own symptoms and your own body and what you react to, and so on and so forth. So Western medicine, I think, most of the time has a hard time dealing with these types of conditions. And many of the mental disorders are actually chronic, right? They do have acute phases and so on, but many of them are for a lifetime, right? So my question is, do you think that it is possible to basically expand your critique to cover Western medicine at large, which is really good with dealing with acute conditions, but also when it doesn't rely on these experiential accounts, when the patients feel very much unheard, it fails in very significant ways. Do you think it's possible?
That's a great question and great suggestion. So my sister is an infectious diseases professor, and she and I talk a lot about, and she's a humanist doctor.
I be an expert maybe.
Go to her. She's good. But I mean, she's great. She's a humanist. But I mean, it's very true, right? And especially if you're a patient with HIV or hepatitis and so on, it's a chronic condition, and they really sometimes need to just talk to someone about that process. So this is becoming actually this very problem about like not hearing patients' voices or their stories in general in Western medicine at large is becoming a very exciting and hot topic right now. So I'm in a department that has a large medical humanities program, and medical humanities as an area is basically primarily targeting this. Like, how do we make experts, the doctors, more humanistic and more human? How do we train them to become actually, to be able to give uptake to patients' stories that, you know, the feminists have written about, like, you know, giving uptake, the importance of uptake in listening to people and so on. So in that sense, there's actually really exciting stuff happening. So there's a book, I haven't read it yet, but I read a short article version of it. So they included HIV, people with HIV in San Francisco to part of a, you know, research program on HIV. And part of that inclusion actually involved training them a little bit from the kind of more about the academic or medical aspect of the condition, and asking for their first-person experience and input. And there's now a book published about this and so on. So it's starting to happen in these other areas in the medical field as well. And there's a philosopher of science, Rachel Ankeny. She talks, for instance, about the clinical case reporting. So clinical case reports are very important in general areas of medicine, right? You write about your patient, this particular case, how it was anomalous, and how you treated them, and then they serve this as this resource for other doctors with similar kinds of patients. So in these case stories, usually you can't really generalize, you don't have a big sample, but you have like 1 or 2 cases that was similar, and you try this new methodology, and it worked, and you know, come up with a publication about it. And Rachel Ankeny talks about the kind of process, the process there is about increasing our understanding of this condition, right? Because it's like different and variant in different cases, it teaches us something. And she talks about how we should also include the first-person perspective in that clinical case reporting, so that it doesn't become something, a project that involves only the experts who like saw the patient and work with the patient, but involve their feedback and kind of share with them and maybe even include them as authors in the case reporting. So there is some kind of new, I think most of these are fundamentally kind of influence of feminist philosophy of science, but things are kind of shaking up, or at least there is more awareness of the existence of the problem. But that's a great question.
So, yeah, I'm very excited about this project as well, exactly because of what I said. The project of including first-person accounts to overcome the shortcomings of medical paradigms, especially in cases as complex as chronic illnesses. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to its development. My question was really simple, actually, and maybe technical. Do you think it is more beneficial to be looking for first-person accounts of people with mental disorders given during active phases or during remission, or any is prioritized?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, that's like kind of my limitation as a philosopher, right? I'm not, you know, I'm not in these contexts where, like so far, I really benefited from people who had all these experiences and found a way to manage and survive and wrote about their experience, which is very selective. But I think in that like very acute phase, like in the early diagnostic stages or whatever, it might not be realistic, and it might even be oppressive to expect patients to also give you information about what they're going through, right? I mean, in some cases it might help the patient to talk about it, but in some other cases, you're like, hey, can I talk to you? Like while you're in this like crazy manic stage, might be not be the best time.
While you're suffering.
But yeah, but I think that's a great point. Like, I think once we start thinking about it in this way, those are the questions that we would have to answer, right? How do we do this? Like, what is the best stage, or is there a best stage? And you know, I'm a philosopher. You know, I don't necessarily always sit in the armchair, but I kind of what I can do is make recommendations, and hopefully, you know, there will be some kind of uptake from scientists and kind of think about this more in a more scientifically rigorous way about like how to operate that process. Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah.
Okay. So Bill, and then maybe you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I was also wondering about the question that Phil was wondering about. But I'm not going to ask you more about
Okay.
that. Because I thought that there's another, so you might think of sort of mental illness, and you might then think, okay, so there are related figures. One is sort of chronic physical illness. And you might ask what the same points arise there, and that's really what you don't seem to be asking. But another thing that's slightly different and might give you, slightly different answers, but also, provide the basis for interesting case studies is sort of intellectual disability or cognitive disability. So one thought I had about that was, okay, so in the case of sort of, recurrent mental illness that has remission, then you can get somebody to sort of, but it seems to me, in the case of intellectual disability, that's not going to be so clear. But it also seems to me there's a good case, there are quite nice potential case studies where you might think, okay, in the case of intellectual disability, the intellectually disabled do bring some kind of perspective that the expertise can't bring. So I'm thinking, that there's a lot of, as it were, first-person critique of a lot of theory of mind research in autism, for example. There's quite a lot of sort of first-person critique also of a lot of assumptions that were being made about Down syndrome in the 1960s and 1970s. So it might be that, these are nice examples that you can use to say, okay, in disability studies, there's been all this stuff that actually really does quite strongly suggest that there's something that the patient perspective or the...
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
And if it's right in the case of intellectual disability, then it's maybe even more plausible that it's going to be...
Yeah, I have to admit, I actually just recently started reading disability studies scholars more closely, but there are definitely a lot of cognate moves that I can make, and I'm really curious to check out the ones on Down syndrome, and that I think would be a great analogy. Thank you for that.
Well, thanks for this very illuminating talk. It made me to think so many things again and again. But I have simple observations and simple questions.
Okay.
Who defines the illnesses, or who defines mental disorders? Here I see epistemic violence. And this observation could relate to who practices psychiatry throughout history. Women, as far as I know, haven't practiced psychiatry quite a lot, maybe recently, in recent times. So, I think gender issue is very much in question here. And the other question is whether women, again throughout history, have been able to express their emotions or their problems, even their resentments. I think first-person accounts is very, very important, because we talk about a sex who hasn't been able to talk centuries. Maybe they've been talking about themselves, but when it comes to the, just illnesses or problems that they experience, I see that because I am in the field usually. They are unable to express their emotions, their opinions, and how they are hurt. And sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes for social reasons, traditions, so many things comes into the question. So I think psychiatrists do not know. They are unable to come to they are unable to come to touch with reality. They describe that prescribe. And especially women have been described and prescribed. So, what would you say?
And it's still continuing, like the premenstrual dysmorphic disorder example. You ask very important questions, and I don't have answers to all of them. I don't. I mean, the first question I think is about the metaphysics of mental disorder. That's a very, very important project. In fact, when I first started becoming interested in these topics, I was interested in understanding the self and kind of thinking about mental disorder in that context, and I really dived like deep into like the natural kinds and the metaphysics of it. But then I kind of grew dissatisfied with the metaphysical project. I still believe that it's an important project to be pursued, and my dissatisfaction, I think, had to do with the urgency of kind of the field, like, and there are so many injustices, and what you listed is a list of injustices that have been kind of incurred by mostly women and minorities and people, African Americans and so on. They have been disproportionately affected by a lot of violence, actually, committed by psychiatrists in different ways. And I really wanted to kind of not just think about like what mental illness is in the abstract, in the metaphysical project, though I think that will be a project at some point, an immediate project, but then I started thinking about, okay, who are these people who are classifying and diagnosing mental disorders? And that took me to the, APA and the DSM and like the military and, primarily a bunch of men, no insult, but making all these decisions about like what gets, who gets to the war, who goes to the war, and who's mentally ill and whatnot. But I think, as you said, the first person accounts are very, very important. And I think it's kind of, now, Typhoid Mary, I think I always give that example. She's an immigrant woman who had, who was diagnosed with typhoid, and she did not want to be treated. But she was giving, it was very interesting because she doesn't herself suffer from the illness, but she actually spreads the disease. And she's like a typical medical case in all of those narratives about Typhoid Mary. We imagine this like angry woman who doesn't want to be treated and diagnosed an illness, and yet she's spreading this disease. But when you look closely to the story of Typhoid, to Mary, she's an immigrant. She's an Irish immigrant woman living in New York at a time where, just like now, immigrants are not welcome, and suffering from all kinds of problems, and she's poor and she wants to keep her job. So if you think about her story in that context, then you can't blame her really for not wanting to be treated, because she has to make money and earn a living for her kids. And as you said, the history is written in a way always to disadvantage, and I think create, understanding or thinking about that first-person perspectives or first-person accounts becomes crucial. Thinking about Mary in this way made me really question in the way that story has been told in documentaries and everywhere, where like we are kind of thinking about this, witch who's spreading the disease and not accepting treatment, but she's an immigrant woman working hard and wants to make money, and of course she's not going to be like treated in a hospital and so on. So I'm in complete agreement. And yeah, I wish I had more time to talk more about like gender-specific issues in psychiatry, but hopefully next year in Muğla, when we are having our second C-SWIP, there's a running joke. We've been pressuring Professor Erkazan to have a second SWIP in Muğla, so. Yeah.
You said that the patient's perspective is relevant and highly important because it's the first-person perspective. What about the perspectives of relatives and family members of the patients, because they are experiencing this stuff with these people. So probably there are common tendencies as well in their experience, their suffering or their problems with the person who is a mental.
Exactly, and in some cases, people with mental illness don't recognize or accept that they have mental illness, and the family is suffering.
And probably you can identify the illness through the experience of their relatives
as well. Yeah, and in the case of even severe cognitive impairments, for instance, in that case, you may not be able to rely on the first person, like the patient, herself or himself, but their family members. That's why I kind of listed the, you know, that leg of trilateral strategy as first-person accounts, because that could be the patient, the mom. Exactly, great.
If no one else asks the question, I want to say something related. It's not a question, it's not going to be a question. Okay. But I recently read something that will support your case. Recently I read somewhere, I don't know where, that a couple of psychiatrists checked themselves into mental clinics all over the United States just to see the inside the workings of the mental clinics. And they're all professors, and they took notes of their experiences while they were there. And they were managed to trick all the doctors, the psychiatrists there, but they weren't able to trick the people, the patients. So they said later on in their article that they published collaboratively, that in fact some of them were made to stay as long as 2 months, right, by the psychiatrists in the hospital. So anyway, they were saying that so the patients could recognize that they were not, mentally sick, but the doctors were.
There you go. Oh, this is great.
So maybe I should try to find out.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, I don't know too. I told you so. That's great. Thank you for that. Yes.
Okay, let's thank Şerife, Tekin for